This presentation is being made available by the General Ridgway Pittsburgh chapter of the Military Order of the World Wars, which has as one of its goals the education of young people in our way of government and our free enterprise system. This show depicts the events leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Imperial Air Force in December of 1941, which caused the United States to declare a state of war between the two nations. This presentation will disclose who the major players were in the conduct of the war and raise the question, should the United States have anticipated the attack? The Hawaiian Islands consist of 8 islands about 2,500 miles west of the United States. The 6 islands of Oahu is where Pearl Harbor is located, which is the home of the United States Pacific Naval Fleet back in 1941. Here we can see an aerial view of Pearl Harbor with the Ford Island on the right. A major portion of the United States Naval's fleet was anchored around Ford Island on the fatal day of the attack. A memorial to the USS Arizona marks the place where it was sunk in 1941. Here's a quick overview of the world situation in the late 1940s into 1941, which will give you a better understanding of why the war broke out. A. Japan was at war with China since 1937, when Japan invaded Manchuria. B. Germany invaded Poland September 30, 1939, and England declared war on Germany. The United States' Lend-Lease Act of 1941 provided support for England. D. Americans were in favor of isolationism. The American First Committee may have been the largest anti-war organization, having 800,000 members. Charles Lindbergh was an outspoken member of that committee. C. Japan wanted Western powers out of the Far East. F. Japan, Germany, and Italy joined in what was known as the Tripartite Pact, which assured their mutual protection from other countries. Key United States figures who played an important role in the conduct of the war against Japan included President Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and Ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew. The Army was headed by Henry Stinson, Secretary of War, with George Marshall as Army Chief of Staff, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, Commanding General, Hawaiian Department. The Navy was headed by Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, with Admiral Harold Clark, Chief of Naval Operations, and Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander of Chief Pacific Command. On October 7, 1940, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur McCullum, a member of the Navy Central Intelligence Agency, delivered this memorandum to higher-ups outlining steps that should be taken by the United States. However, it is not known if it found its way to President Roosevelt's desk, even though many of the items were implemented. In order to stop aggression by the Japanese, McCullum recommended the following actions. Establish a military presence in the British bases. Maintain presence in the Dutch East Indies. Provide aid to Chiang Kai-shek. Send cruisers and submarines to the Orient. Send 2 divisions of subs to the Orient. Keep the United States fleet in Hawaii. And have the Dutch refuse Japan's request for oil and stop all U.S. trade with Japan. In January of 1941, Henry Stimson, U.S. Secretary of War, alerted Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, that they had undertaken a renewed study concerning the security of the United States Pacific Fleet while in Pearl Harbor and the Pearl Harbor Naval Base itself, due to increased gravity of the situation with respect to Japan, and have come to the conclusion that if war eventuates with Japan, it is believed that hostilities would be initiated by a surprise attack upon the fleet of the naval base at Pearl Harbor. He suggested that steps be taken as rapidly as possible to increase the readiness of the Army and Navy to withstand a raid on Pearl Harbor. Now, let us review the events leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. A. In April of 1940, Roosevelt transferred the United States fleet to Pearl Harbor as a presumed deterrent to Japanese expansion. Japan needed resources to carry on its war against China, which began in 1937. B. In July of 1940, the U.S. passed the Export Control Act, which gave power to the president to prohibit trade with Japan of certain critical war resources. C. November 1940. The British executed a successful torpedo attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto, which led to the Japanese to think that they could do the same thing at Pearl Harbor, since both locations had shallow harbors. D. In January 1941, Joseph Crew, the ambassador to Japan, secretly cabled the State Department information gathered by the Peruvian diplomat that Japan was considering an attack on Pearl Harbor. Keep in mind that this was 11 months prior to the attack. Now, here are some additional interesting facts leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. 10 months before the attack on February 1941, Admiral Stark sent the following message to Admiral Kimmel concerning the ambassador Crew's cable. Quote, "The Division of Naval Intelligence places no credence on these rumors. Furthermore," he said, "based on known data regarding the present disposition and employment of Japanese naval and army forces, no move against Pearl Harbor appears imminent or planned for the foreseeable future." End quote. 10 days before the attack on November 27, 1941, news of Japan's fleet's probable approach on Pearl Harbor reached U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. On that day, he sent a message to Hawaiian commanders stating, quote, "Hostile action possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit to the first overt act. This policy should not be construed as restricting you to a course of action that might jeopardize your defense." 7 days before the attack on November 30th, 1941, the front page of Honolulu's newspaper read, "Japan may strike over the weekend." 3 days before the attack on December 4th, Australian intelligence reported to Roosevelt that the missing Japanese fleet was indeed moving towards Pearl Harbor. 9 days before the attack on November 28, 1941, a secret message was sent from Tokyo to the Japanese ambassador meeting with Cordell Hull, United States Secretary of State, after the United States refused to lift an oil embargo on Japan. The message read, "Well, you two ambassadors have exerted superhuman efforts, but in spite of this, the United States has gone ahead and presented this humiliating proposal. This was quite unexpected and extremely regrettable. The imperial government can by no means use it as a basis for negotiations. Therefore, the negotiations will be de facto ruptured. However, I do not wish you to give the impression that the negotiations were broken off, merely to say to them that you are awaiting instructions. Say that we have always demonstrated a long-suffering and conciliatory attitude, but that, on the other hand, the U.S. has been unbendingly made it impossible for Japan to establish negotiations." Prime Minister of Japan was Hideko Toho. He was 55 in 1941. Hideko Toho was general in the Imperial Japanese Army and the 40th Prime Minister of Japan. He served as Prime Minister during much of World War II, from October 18, 1941 to July 22, 1944. He was sentenced to death for war crimes after the war and executed by hanging. Hirohito, at age 25, became the 123rd Emperor of Japan. 2 years before, in 1924, he married Nagato, the eldest daughter of a family which was not considered to be within the 5 ruling families of Japan. They had 7 children, and the oldest son is currently the Emperor of Japan. Nagato lived to be 97 years old and was a distinction of being the longest-serving empress of Japan, 75 years. She died in 2000. Hirohito died in 1989 at the age of 87. Here we can see a picture of Prime Minister Toho dressed in military uniform, together with his civilian cabinet in October of 1941. Pictured here is the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters building where General Yumizu, the Chief of the Army General Staff, and Fleet Admiral Yamamoto, Chief of the Naval General Staff, met to plan the war against the United States. General Yoshiro Umezu, Chief Army General Staff. After the war, he was arrested and tried as a war criminal. He was found guilty of waging a war of aggression and sentenced to life imprisonment in November 1948. While in prison, he became a convert to Christianity. He died in prison in 1949. Fleet Admiral Isayuko Yamamoto, Chief of the Navy General Staff, was a commander-in-chief of the Combined Fleet during World War II. He was a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and a student at the U.S. Naval War College and the Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He served as naval attaché in Washington. In 1924, he was appointed executive officer of the Navy's flight school, although he was not a pilot. Yamamoto first began disclosing his plans to attack Pearl Harbor in March of 1940, and he was instrumental in convincing the Imperial headquarters that his plan was feasible. He died during an inspection flight of the Solomon Islands when his aircraft was shot down by American P-38 fighter planes. Lieutenant Rex Barber is credited with downing the Yamamoto's plane. Intelligence sources had learned that Yamamoto would be flying in a bomber on an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the southern Solomon Islands when Lieutenant Barber downed his plane. He retired as a colonel. Upon his military discharge, Barber returned to Culver, Oregon, and resided there for the next 40 years. He worked as an insurance agent and at different times served in the city of Culver as a mayor and judge. Vice Admiral Nagumo was a commander-in-chief of the 1st Air Fleet. He committed suicide while defending Saipan in 1944. He was posthumously promoted to admiral. Commander Fushida was leader of the air attack. He fired the flare that began the attack. At 0753, Fushida ordered his radio operator to send back to the carrier flagship the code Tora, 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 which meant the attack had begun. After the war, Fushida converted to Christianity. He became a Christian missionary and toured the United States as a member of the Worldwide Christian Ministry, Army of Sky Pilots. He died in 1976. Vice Admiral Onishi was head of the Naval Aviation Development Division in the Ministry of Munitions. He played a key role with Commander Genda in developing the Pearl Harbor attack. Later, he opposed the attack on grounds that it would lead to war with America, which had greater resources. He was responsible for ordering kamikaze suicide attacks. He committed suicide after Japan surrendered and apologized to the 4,000 pilots which he sent to their death. Commander General Da's plan of attack included the following concerns. A. The attack must catch the United States completely by surprise, otherwise the Americans would counterattack. B. The main objective would be to destroy U.S. carriers in order to restrict the U.S. long-range capability. And C. Another priority target would be the U.S. land-based planes to prevent them from following Japanese planes back to their carriers. D. Every available Japanese carrier should participate to cause maximum damage to the United States fleet. Yamamoto's tentative plan was to use 1 or 2 carrier divisions that would be located about 500 miles north of Pearl Harbor. 500 or 600 planes would fly one-way missions. The planes would drop their bombs, and ditched the planes in the sea on the way back toward the carriers. Cruisers and submarines would then pick up the pilots. He was concerned that the United States fleet would attack Japanese fleet. General Da was successful in overriding Yamamoto's plan since it would result in the loss of seasoned pilots. Additional parts of Commander Minoru General Da's plan of attack included utilize all types of bombing, torpedo, dive, and high-level bombing. General Da placed priority on torpedo bombing and next on dive bombers, since high-level bombing proved ineffective in China. Fighter planes would play an active role in protecting bombers and carriers. The attack would take place in the early morning of daylight, since there were no precise instruments to assist in nighttime operations. Refueling at sea would be necessary. Tankers had to accompany the task force. There must be strict secrecy. The outcomes of the initial strike was dependent on complete surprise. General Da also wanted to send 15,000 troops to invade Pearl Harbor, which was vetoed by Yamamoto. General Da did not think battleships were necessary. They would make it too large a task force and increase risk of rediscovery. They would magnify fuel problems. As you can see from this chart, the Pacific and Asiatic territory, Japan's Navy outnumbered the United States fleet, especially in the number of aircraft carriers. Pictured here is a Japanese consulate building in Honolulu, which was suspected of being the central location of Japan's spy ring. Takeo Yoshikawa replaced the Japanese ambassador to the United States, which was considered out of the ordinary by the FBI due to his young age. As it turned out, he was in fact a master spy. Yoshikawa would take daily trips to lookout points where he could see Ford Island and the anchored ships. He drew meticulous pictures of the harbor and its ships, which he passed on to his superiors. This was a critical and essential contribution to the planned attack. Homer Kisner, Traffic Chief Code Decryptor, was able to break the Japanese naval code with the Underwood Morse code machine. This gave the Navy a decided advantage in knowing what the Japanese were planning. Kisner sent warnings of massive movements of the Japanese carrier fleet that apparently never reached the top U.S. Navy officials. However, there are some theorists that contend that Franklin D. Roosevelt not only knew about the Japanese attack, but deliberately encouraged the surprise Japanese bombing raid on Pearl Harbor in order to gain support for entering the war against Germany, Japan's ally. What were some of the problems facing Japan in planning the attack? Pilot training and low-altitude flying to release torpedoes, torpedo bombing in shallow waters. The use of wooden fins solved that problem. Refueling at sea for ships and aircraft. Organization of the task force, that is, the number of tankers, aircraft carriers, destroyers, etc. Selection of command personnel qualified to plan and execute the attack. Deception tactics to mislead the United States military. Date and time of the attack, and route of approach to avoid detection and return of the ships. The Japanese carrier task force left northern Japan on the 26th of November 1941 and traveled about 4,500 miles and arrived at the destination 230 miles north of the Hawaiian Islands on the 6th of December, whereupon it began its air attack on Pearl Harbor the morning of December 7th. After the attack, the carrier task force returned to southern Japan. Pictured here is one of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, the Zuki Kaku, that took part in the December 7th attack at Pearl Harbor. It carried 72 aircraft, a crew of 1,660, and had a range of 6,800 miles. Here is a picture taken of a Japanese aircraft carrier just before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Notice the size of the torpedoes and the use of wooden stabilizers to allow for the dropping of torpedoes in shallow water. Japanese aircraft being ready for takeoff in the Shokokaku aircraft carrier, the morning of December 7, 1941. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in two waves from the north. At 7:55 a.m., 51 Japanese dive bombers and 40 torpedo bombers, 50 high-level bombers, and 43 Zero fighters began the island-wide attack. Torpedoes were specifically designed with wooden fins for the shallow waters of the Pearl Harbor. This diagram depicts the ill-fated positioning of U.S. ships prior to the attack. Notice that the major destroyers were anchored on the southwest side of the Ford Island, which included the Arizona, the Nebraska, the Tennessee, the West Virginia, the Oklahoma, the Maryland, the California, and the Pennsylvania, which were anchored at the naval station. All of these ships and others suffered major damage, which you will see later in this presentation. This slide shows a portion of the naval station at Pearl Harbor in 1940 and the future positioning of battleships along the southwest side of the Ford Island. Here's a photograph taken at the beginning of the attack from a Japanese plane showing Ford Island and Battleship Row looking southeast. The explosion in the center of the photo is a torpedo strike on the USS West Virginia. Here are the reasons why a third attack was not initiated by Admiral Nagumo, Fushida, and General Da, chief architects of the attack. They urged Admiral Nagumo to carry out a third strike to destroy as much of the Pearl Harbor's dry dock facilities as possible. This would have seriously hampered the U.S.'s ability to retaliate over a year. Nagumo decided to withdraw for several reasons. American anti-aircraft performance had improved considerably during the second strike, and two-thirds of the Japanese losses were incurred during the second wave. The location of the American carriers remained unknown. Admiral Nagumo was concerned that his force was now within range of American land-based bombers. He was uncertain about the number of planes remaining in Pearl Harbor. A third wave would require substantial preparation and turnaround time. Returning planes would have to land on carriers at night. The Japanese Navy had not developed night carrier techniques. This was a substantial task. The task force's fuel situation did not permit it to remain in waters north of Pearl Harbor much longer. And finally, he believed the second wave effectively satisfied the main objective of his mission. The next morning, aboard the Yamato flagship, Yamato agreed with Nagumo's decision not to have a third wave. However, later in the war, he regretted this decision. The deployment of Japanese subs at Pearl Harbor. There were 5 two-man midget subs deployed at Pearl Harbor. However, 2 made it into the harbor. The minesweeper USS Condor spotted a midget submarine periscope and alerted destroyer USS Ward. That midget sub was disappeared at that time. The USS Ward sank another sub at 6:37 a.m., which was the first sub to be sunk. A midget sub on the north side of the Fort Island missed the USS Curtis with her first torpedo and missed the attacking USS Monoguam with her second before being sunk by the USS Monoguam at 8:43 a.m. That was the second to be sunk. A third sub grounded twice, once outside the harbor entrance and again on the east side of Oahu, where it was captured on the 8th of December. Ensign Sak Amigwam ashore that became the first Japanese POW. A fourth had damaged by the depth charge and abandoned by its crew before it could fire its torpedoes and enter the harbor. It is believed that the fifth sub was successful torpedoing the USS West Virginia. Final disposition of the sub is unknown. This is a Japanese photo of the attack on Battleship Row. In the left center of the photo, you can see the wake of a submarine. Here we can see the diagram of the two-man Japanese midget submarine. It is powered by batteries, it has two torpedoes, and is about 80 feet long. Midget sub-crew members were considered hero gods in Japan. Even though there were 10 members for the 5 subs, only 9 were pictured in this tapestry. Sakami-ki, the captain who was captured, was in the eyes of the Japanese a disgrace and not included in the portrait. Here we can see the naval dispatch by Lieutenant Commander Ramsey 5 minutes after the first attack. The radar crew that first sighted a group of planes believed them to be B-17s due in from California. The radar technician was not sure what he was seeing and reported it to the officer of the watch, who failed to take any action. The USS West Virginia took 7 torpedoes port side. The ship's commander, Captain Marvin S. Bennion, was killed on the bridge of the ship. Under her own power, she went to Bremerton, Washington for reconstruction. She participated in the Battle of Lafayette Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She was decommissioned in 1947 and sold for scrap in 1959. The USS California served as flagship of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. She was repaired at Pearl Harbor and participated in a number of South Pacific battles. She was decommissioned and sold for scrap in 1959. The USS Oklahoma took 9 torpedoes, causing the deaths of 429 men. 32 men were saved from the bowels of the capsized ship. The 3 Barber brothers, Leroy, Randolph, and Malcolm, who joined the Navy together in 1940, perished aboard the Oklahoma, never to be returned home for burial. Aerial view of the refloating of the USS Oklahoma during the period February to December 1943. She was decommissioned in 1944 and sold in 1946. While under tow to San Francisco in 1947, the Oklahoma sank 504 miles outside of Pearl Harbor. Pictured in 2007, the battleship Missouri has been designated a national monument. It is docked where the USS Oklahoma battleship was sunk on December 7th. The USS Pennsylvania was among the first ships to fire against the enemy attack. She had light damage and had 15 crew members killed. Subsequently, she was repaired and engaged in shore bombardment of Attu, the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Guam, and other South Pacific battles. She was used as a target ship in the atomic bomb test in 1946, after which she was decommissioned. She was intentionally sunk in 1948 after radiological studies. The USS Nevada was the only battleship to get underway during the attack. However, she was struck by 1 torpedo and 6 bombs. She served as a fire support ship and convoy escort for the rest of the war. She was decommissioned in 1946 and sunk during the Naval Gunfire Practice Exercise in 1948. The USS Arizona was sunk at Pearl Harbor with a loss of 1,177 lives. The ship was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1989. Here we can see the USS Arizona salvage activities beginning in February of 1942. This is a picture of the Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. The Arizona was the most heavily damaged battleship, having suffered 4 direct bomb hits. The USS Maryland was protected from torpedoes by the Oklahoma. However, she was struck by two bombs. The firepower of the Maryland played a key role in the amphibious campaigns of the Pacific. She was sold for scrap in 1959. Hickam Field was named after Lieutenant Colonel Horace Hickam. While a student at Indiana University, he joined the Indiana National Guard, then received an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy. He was commissioned as second lieutenant in the cavalry in 1908. He served as a professor of military science and tactics at the University of Maine. He was killed while participating in night landing at Fort Crockett in November 1934. The gates at the entrance of Hickam Field are believed to be a replica of those at Kitty Hawk Airfield. The ill-fated alignment of aircraft at Hickam Field allowed for easy destruction by Japanese planes. 12 unarmed B-17s were on their way to the Philippines when they were attacked by the Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor. They safely landed at various airfields, except for the one that landed at Hickam Airfield, which was destroyed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not without retaliation by U.S. forces, as witnessed by the amount of anti-aircraft explosions which filled the sky. Pictured here is one of 29 Japanese planes shot down. Honolulu Star Bulletin headlines published December 7, 1941. War, Oahu bombed by Japanese planes, wherein President Roosevelt announced the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Manila. The United States casualties of the attack resulted in 2,403 killed in action and 1,178 wounded in action. This slide provides a reconciliation of ships destroyed and restored. The Arizona and Utah were destroyed, and the 7 remaining battleships subsequently restored. 6 cruisers damaged and subsequently repaired. 2 destroyers salvaged for parts and 2 subsequently repaired. 4 other ships subsequently repaired. 92 Army Air Corps planes and 92 Air Navy planes were destroyed. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel, chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was relieved of command. He retired from the Navy on February 28, 1942. He joined a shipbuilding firm specialized in dry dock construction. He died in 1968. Lieutenant General Walter Short, the commander at the U.S. Army Command at Hawaii, requested retirement from the U.S. Army after the attack. He went to work for Ford Motor Company. He died in 1949. The most damning charges against Kimball and Short were that they failed to appreciate the importance of the November 27th war warning message from General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. In 2000, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution saying that Kimball and Short had performed their duties completely and professionally. President Roosevelt's famous declaration of war against Japan began with yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Thus began World War II. On December 8, 1941, an announcement of war between Japan and the United States by the representatives of the Japanese Navy Department was officially announced. This map disclosed the extent of Japan's conquest of the Far East during World War II. Also shown are major battles fought to regain path to victory over Japan. They occurred at Midway, Saipan, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Here we can see what it was like to be on the home front. Rumors spread that Japanese-American fishermen were mining harbors. Anti-aircraft batteries were established in the Hollywood Hills. A National Guard sentry shot and killed a woman who failed to stop her car. Organizers of the football Rose Bowl ordered to move from Pasadena to North Carolina. The Metropolitan Opera announced it would not present Madame Butterfly, a Japanese opera. In D.C., someone cut down 4 cherry trees, gift from the Emperor of Japan. The president vetoed a plan to have the White House camouflaged. The Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle raid on Tokyo with 16 B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet took place on April 17, 1942, the first and only time U.S. bombers were launched from a U.S. aircraft carrier on a combat mission. All 16 aircraft were lost on the mission, and of the 80 crew members, 11 were either killed or captured. The crews of 14 aircraft were recovered and returned to the United States. Since the USS Hornet was spotted by a Japanese observation plane, Doolittle's B-25s had to launch 700 miles out versus 300 miles as originally planned. A major turning point in the war took place in June 1942 near Midway Island, a possession of the United States, where U.S. carrier planes sank 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers, thus rendering the Japanese Navy ineffective. During the Battle of Midway, the Japanese sank the USS Yorktown aircraft carrier, which played a key role in sinking 2 Japanese aircraft carriers. Here we can see the Battle of Midway comparative naval losses between the United States and Japan. The bombing of Oregon. The only aerial bombing of mainland America during World War II by a foreign power occurred when an attempt to start a forest fire was made by a Japanese seaplane dropping 2 incendiary bombs over Mount Emily near Brookings, Oregon. The seaplane piloted by Fujita had been launched from a Japanese submarine. No significant damage was officially reported following the attack. V-mail was adopted by the military in the spring of 1942 to lessen the logistical problems associated with mail. Senders had to complete a V-mail form, which was sent to Washington. Censors edited the V-mail by blocking out sensitive war information, and the forms were then placed in 16-millimeter film. The reel would hold about 18,000 V-mails. The reels were transported to the war zone where photostatic copies were produced and placed in envelopes. One mail sack could hold about 150,000 V-mails as opposed to 37 mail sacks. During the war, 556 million V-mails were processed. In July 1945, the Allied powers asked Japan to surrender unconditionally. Japan leaders refused. Therefore, the U.S. Air Force dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, one in Hiroshima, the other in Nagasaki, to force Tokyo to surrender, which they did unconditionally. The Japanese signed the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. The Japanese Foreign Minister Shimotsu signed on behalf of Japan. He was convinced of war crimes and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. He was paroled in 1950 and again served as foreign minister from 1954 to 1956. He died in 1957 at the age of 76. Japanese Chief of the Army General Staff General Umezu also signed on behalf of Japan. He died in prison in 1949. After the Japanese representative signed the surrender, General Douglas MacArthur was the first to sign for the Allied forces. He and Commander Matthew Perry, the United States flag placed on the surrender deck of the USS Missouri, since he was a cousin of Commodore Perry, who had encouraged the opening of Japan's ports to the west after entering Tokyo Bay. Pictured are other allies who signed the instrument of surrender. The Canadian representative, Colonel Lawrence Cosgrave, signed below the line instead of above it on the Japanese copy, forcing everyone after him to sign one line below the intended one. When the discrepancy was pointed out to General Sutherland, he simply crossed out the pre-printed names of the Allied nations and wrote them himself in their correct relative positions. The Japanese representative had nothing further to say. Excerpts from the Instrument of Surrender. We hereby proclaim the unconditional surrender to the Allied forces. We hereby command all Japanese forces and the Japanese people to cease hostilities forthwith. We hereby command the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to issue at once orders to surrender unconditionally. We hereby command all civil, military, and naval officials to obey and enforce all proclamations deemed by the Supreme Commander for the Allied forces. We hereby undertake for the Emperor to carry out the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration in good faith. We hereby command the Japanese at once to liberate all Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees. At the White House, President Harry S. Truman announces the Japanese surrender on August 14, 1945. President Roosevelt had passed away on April of 1945. The headlines from the Pittsburgh Sun-Telegraph newspaper on Tuesday, the 14th of August, 1945, announces the end of the war with Japan. The kiss that was reached around the world. August 14, 1945 was declared VJ Day, that is, Victory Against Japan.